It is 2:13 a.m. somewhere in Central Africa. A man is standing at the edge of a dirty road alone. His name, let's call him Paul. His face will never appear on any national newspaper and nobody will ever make any documentary about him, not even me. But tonight, he's responsible for something worth more than he will ever earn in his entire lifetime. Behind him is a convoy of heavy trucks sitting idling with engines running in the dark. And beside these trucks are armed guards standing in silence. Paul checks his wristwatch. It is 2:13 a.m. already, right on schedule. He has done this before, many times, same road, same darkness, and the same instruction. So he lights his cigarette, looks down the empty road, and for a moment, something feels different about tonight. Then he looks at the trucks and the guards in the dark. Suddenly, his phone rings, and a very faint voice gives him an order. Move now. He drops his cigarette, crushes it under his boot, and raises his hands in signal. Quietly and religiously, the trucks behind him begins to move. He watches them disappear into the darkness, one by one, until there is nothing left but silence. Paul knows that the darkness is not their final destination, and within 48 hours, the content of those trucks will be sitting somewhere outside the continent. He stands there alone in the dark, on this road with no name, in a continent the world calls poor. And what just drove past him will power cities he has never visited, build technology he will never own, and fund economies he will never benefit from. He does not know this, or maybe he does, because somewhere deep down in his mind, he is aware that what just left in those trucks was never supposed to leave. And he knows that this has been happening for decades, long before his forefathers existed. Why this is going on somewhere thousands of miles away, behind closed doors, in a room on the 14th floor, with no office assistants, no cameras or records. 4 men in expensive suits, where the real order came from, are already discussing it. On the table in front of them is the map of Africa, and on this map, certain regions are circled, certain borders are marked, while some countries have numbers written next to them, very large numbers. Suddenly, one of the men leans forward, taps the location on the map, and says quietly, "This one is ready." Nobody asks what he means, because they already know. Another man opens a folder, slides a single document with no letterhead or official stamp across the table, just signatures and numbers. The man at the end of the table looks at it, smiles and nods once. And just like that, the fate of a region changes. No election, no debate, and not even an announcement. Just 4 men, a map, and a nod. This is the story of why every powerful country wants Africa.
AFRICOM's campaign revolves around the central theme of ensuring strategic access. This campaign places our African partners at the center.
In 2007, something changed quietly inside Washington. A new military command was being created for Africa. They called it AFRICOM. And publicly, the explanation sounded reasonable. They said it is for peacekeeping and for helping Africans. But after AFRICOM appeared, American military activity across Africa began expanding quietly. A drone site here, an outpost there, and one by one, they began appearing across the continent. And the deeper you look, the stranger it becomes, because the countries receiving the most American attention often seem to have something else too. Natural resources like oil, gold, critical minerals, or even strategic coastlines or shipping routes. And suddenly, what looked like military assistance starts looking more like positioning. But it wasn't for today, but for the future. Because powerful countries rarely move towards places randomly. They move towards importance, and the continent of Africa was becoming so impossible to ignore. By now, Paul's convoy no longer feels isolated. Those trucks were part of something larger, something already unfolding across the continent. But here's where the story gets darker, because while Washington expanded its military footprint, another power without military bases or drone sites was secretly moving into Africa differently. Just contracts, ports, railways, mining deals, and infrastructural projects. And by the time much of the world noticed it, they were already everywhere. But here is what almost nobody talks about. Those contracts, ports, and railways, they all came with something buried deep inside them. Something most African leaders either never read or never fully understood until it was too late. Because beneath the promises of development were conditions, very quiet conditions, that was carefully written in legal languages designed to confuse you. And when the loans could not be repaid, China did not ask for money, it asked for something else, like your airports, the seaport, even your power stations and your lands. And without a single bullet fired, they asked for strategic assets to be handed over quietly. For a minute, they did that without any single war or army at the border, just paperwork. Suddenly, the roads, the airports, and the railways stopped feeling like infrastructure. They started feeling like a leverage. And some African leaders only realized this after they had already signed. This was what China understood that most of the world missed. That you actually do not need an army to take over a country. You just need to own everything inside it. Now, just hold on, because here is where it gets interesting. China understood this, and across Africa, the signing had already begun quietly. A contract here and a port there. And before many governments fully understood the consequences of this, their economies were becoming deeply tied to Belgium. This is China's trap, and Africa majestically walked straight into it. In 2013, a small country in Southern Africa received an offer. They called it the Belt and Road Initiative. At first, it sounded almost too good to be true. Roads, bridges, airports, and massive infrastructural projects, all to be financed by China. That country was Zambia, and its leader did what any struggling nation would do. They said yes. Who wouldn't? A country desperate for development, and here was one of the most powerful nations on earth offering to build it for free. Oh, sorry, not exactly free. Because hidden deep within those agreements were numbers, repayment schedules, interest rates, and conditions. Conditions that nobody read out loud in any press conference or public address to the Zambian people. It was just signatures, smiles, handshakes, and photographs. And for a while, the whole deal looked fine. The roads were being built, the airport was already taking shape, everyone could see visible progress. The Zambian hope was coming alive, but then something happened. The bills started arriving, and by 2020, the Zambia government under President Edgar Lungu could not pay. And this is the moment the trap revealed itself. Because China did not send soldiers, they did not even threaten to go to war, rather did they even close their embassy. But instead, they did something very spectacular. China quietly sent lawyers with documents pointing to clauses that had been there all along. And in 2021, Zambia's national electricity company, one of its most critical national assets, came under serious threat of Chinese control. But Zambia was not alone in this trap. Let's take a journey to Kenya. In 2014, President Uhuru Kenyatta stood in front of cameras, smiled, and signed a $3.2 billion agreement for a brand new standard gauge railway that is supposed to connect Mombasa to Nairobi. He called it a new dawn for Kenya. Everyone celebrated, the cameras rolled, the world watched, and somewhere in Belgium, someone smiled too, but for a different reason. Because deep inside that agreement was a clause that will eventually trap them. But by the time anyone realized it, the deal had already been signed, because what they were not told was what would happen if Kenya could not repay. At the moment, that sounds like an ordinary statement, but if you dig deeper, you begin to see another thing, because some parts of that document had a clause that in the event Kenya could not repay, any dispute would not go to an independent court. Such disputes should rather be transferred to a more private location you probably must have heard of. Yeah, your guess is as good as mine. That location is China. And it will be on Chinese terms, under Chinese jurisdiction, settled in Belgium. For a moment, I want you to think about it. It is exactly how it looks. A sovereign African nation signing away its right to defend itself in its own dispute, and the Kenyan people never knew because nobody told them. And here's the part that should make every African stop. These were not mistakes. These clauses or conditions were not accidental. They were deliberate, carefully written and strategically placed by people who understood exactly what they were doing and exactly what Africa would not notice. Because this was never just about development. It was never about helping Africa grow, but it was about something China had been planning for decades: access, control, and leverage over the richest continent on earth. You see, China was not the oldest player in this game. There was another country, one that had been in Africa long before China arrived, one that was asked to leave but never really did. I'm talking about France.
France is the worst of the colonizers from all objective assessment.
For every 14 billion that France takes out of Africa, by the time they finish investing it in the French stock market, they are realizing upwards of 300 billion. So you do the math to see how much money France is taking out of Africa every year. And yet France has the audacity to then look at African countries and call them poor countries.
When African countries gained independence, the whole world celebrated it. New flags were raised, new anthems were written, new presidents were elected, and new nations were eventually born. And France stood back, smiled, and congratulated them publicly. But here is what France did not do. It never left. Because while the flags were changing and the beautiful speeches were being made, just behind the cameras, France was quietly writing new agreements. Agreement that would keep its hands firmly inside the pockets of Africa. But the aftermath of this agreement was yet to be revealed. Long after independence and while the world stopped watching, France finally signed the agreement with Africa. They called it the Franca-Afrique, a name that sounded diplomatic until people started looking at what was really happening behind it. And at the center of that arrangement was something almost nobody questioned at that time: money. Specifically African money. Because even after independence, African money was still flowing through France. Let that sit in your head for a moment. 14 African countries are legally required to deposit a significant portion of their foreign reserves into the French treasury, not in their own central banks or country's vote, and not under their own control, but in Paris. You see, this arrangement was created in 1945 at a time when many African countries were still colonies, when they had no real seat at the table and no control over the decisions being made about their future. And yet, those decisions would shape their economies for decades. Then eventually, when independence came, different flags were raised, national anthems were written, different presidents took office, and different parliaments were formed. To the world, it looked like freedom, but beneath the celebration, the Franca-Afrique agreement remained. Their money stayed in France, regardless of any government and no matter the years involved. And any African leader who dared to challenge it did not last long. But there was one man who discovered the hidden secret, understood everything, and refused to stay silent. He was not the richest leader in Africa, neither was he the most powerful, but he was the most dangerous to France because he was telling the truth. His name is Thomas Sankara. Following a coup in 1983, he became the president of Burkina Faso. a man who looked France directly in the eyes and said no. He told his people the truth about the money, Franco-Africa agreement, and what France was really doing in Africa. He called it what it was. He started paying off Burkina Faso's debts, refused foreign aid, began planting trees, fed his people, and gradually built schools. He was the kind of leader Africa had been waiting for. But something happened. In 1987, Thomas Sankara was assassinated at the age of 37. And the man who replaced him, Blaise Compaoré, immediately restored ties with France. For a moment, I want you to think about that word immediately. The new leader's first act was not for his people, but it was for France. But Thomas was not the only one. Sylvanus Olympio, the first president of Togo, refused to sign France's post-independence agreements. He was assassinated. Modibo Keïta, the first president of Mali, tried to break free from French economic control. Unfortunately, he was removed, and the pattern becomes so impossible to ignore. It was now more visible to the blind that you either say yes to France and you stay in power, or say no and expect something to happen. And while all of this was happening, France was quietly using African money of these 14 countries to fund French banks, French businesses, and for French development. While the countries that money belonged to were being told that they needed foreign aid to survive. Now, I want you for a second to think about that again. France was holding African money in Paris and sending some of it back to Africa as aid, and they call it generosity. This is not history, because this is not something that has ended. In fact, the system is still operating as recently as 2019, and the 14 countries still inside it are home to hundreds of millions of Africans who have never been told. If you dig deeper, you begin to see a clearer picture of the whole thing. That's why America positioned itself militarily, China positioned itself economically, but France never left the bedroom. And that makes it the most intimate betrayal of all, because America, China, and France, three powerful nations coming in with three different methods into one continent with military bases, debt traps, and currency control, all of them arriving with different flags and promises, but all of them living with the same thing: Africa's wealth. Africa gives, they take, and the world calls it partnership. But now, you have seen behind the partnership, behind the contract, basis, and the smile, and there is only one question left, the most uncomfortable one. Now that you know, what are you going to do about it?